Into the fray. All right, into the book we go. We have started our examination of the book of Job, and this morning now we begin our exegesis of it, and we're going to begin right, of course, from the top, as is typical. Now, let me start with a clarification. Nobody really asked me about this, but I realized during the course of the week that I may have implied, I did not intend to, but I may have implied that I had read Calvin's 159 sermons on this book, okay? I did not. In fact, I couldn't find them, actually. I know they're in print somewhere. I just don't know where they are. I did search. My observations were taken from several different documents that I found online as sort of Cliff Notes versions of the sermons. I read several different people who had observations on what Calvin had said. Probably the greatest one was found at ChristianStudyLibrary.org, a man by the name of Derek W.H. Thomas, which was published by the Banner of Truth in 1994, had written somewhat of a summary of these of Calvin's sermons. So I'm taking a good deal of, or I took a good deal of my observations last week from them. But I would note this: even if the summary that was given by this man was inaccurate, okay, even if he wasn't right about what Calvin said, the interpretation that was proposed was still rather interesting to me, highly valuable to me, in fact, and it is the approach I'm going to take to the book. Calvin may not have said it, but even if he didn't, so what? I believe it's true that the way that it's the way that these particular men examines Calvin's sermons. So what this means is that if you did not hear that introduction sermon last week or didn't take the time to listen to it, you will struggle to understand what I'm about to preach. Okay? If you didn't listen to last week's sermon, you will struggle to understand what I'm talking about. So those of you who are regulars here, I would recommend, if you have not, go back and listen to last week's message. It will help you make sense. Now, I want to give a quick review of what I said. I can't cover it all, but I'll give a quick review. First of all, we're talking about a book about a man by the name of Job, and this man lived in Uz around 2000 BC. As I contend, he was a contemporary of Abraham the patriarch living in that part of the world. Okay, but Job is also a book outlining what I believe is the reality of spiritual warfare taking place all around us. It's not a book just about suffering. It's certainly a part of the book, but it's not really a book about suffering per se, because it gives no real answer to the theodicy question. Why is there evil in the world? It doesn't give an answer to that. You read through and get the end of the book and you go, there's no answer given. So I don't think this was a book written specifically about suffering. And I'm also not inclined to see it just as a book about the sovereignty of God either. I mean, I recognize certainly that the sovereignty of God is present, but it doesn't argue anything different than any other book of the Bible does in regards to the issue of sovereignty. And there's nothing here new about the nature of God that isn't expressed right in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the sovereignty of God in a nutshell. So it doesn't really say anything different about that than any other book does. So the question is, what is its primary discourse? And I think it's the reality of spiritual warfare, as understood through the lens of what you remember Paul writing in Ephesians 6:12. Our fight is not against our fight was with principalities and powers. It's with evil forces, not with humans and suffering and issues of this world. But it's about the spiritual war that's taking place over and around us. Or more specifically, how Satan, who apparently cannot accept his fate, inflicts suffering in rebellion against God's decree. He comes and he inflicts suffering all around us as a part of his hatred of humanity. And God, who makes men his own, by grace, allows for such suffering, but gives comfort in that nothing Satan can do will ever alter what it means to be God's elect. No matter what Satan does, in any sense, we will never be anything other than what God has purposed us to be as those in Christ. So Job is also a discourse in how we are to approach evil and suffering. To confess, like Job, that our absolute confidence is that our Redeemer lives. That's how we approach suffering. That's how we approach death. That's how we approach evil. That's how we approach pain, etc. That Christ Jesus has had victory over what the first Adam wrought in this world. When he succumbed to the temptations of the one who hates God, he brought suffering into the world. The second Adam comes to have victory over what he brought. Suffering and death are the results of spiritual warfare, but the resurrection of Jesus has demonstrated the victory that God has over it all as he has decreed. So, there's something very important that we must deal with at the very outset of this book, and that is the character and commitment of the man, Job himself. There is an importance here to understanding the character and commitment of Job in order to understand the book. Okay? And so we come to chapter 1 and verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now take a guess how far we're going to get this morning. There are 4 things that we learn right off the bat from this first verse. 4 things that we learn. Number 1, we learn about a man. We learn about let me rephrase that. We learn about a creature who is a man. Okay, I want to say it that way to make sure that I'm getting across my point. We meet a creature who is a man. This is a book about a human being. Okay? This is a book about a human being, a person created in the image of God. Now, as I said last week, I am convinced that this is a man in history. All right? I think this is an actual person that lived in Uz 4,000 years ago. A real man in history, not some fictional allegory designed to make a point, not some allegorical person that somebody made up in order to try to make a point. I think this is a real person, a real human being, a flesh and blood human being. A human being. If this book deals with the issue of spiritual warfare, then Job, the man, appears as crossfire in the midst of that warfare. A human being in the middle of a war, a spiritual war taking place around us. So I want you to see right off the bat, we're talking about a man here. We're talking about a human being. We're talking about, hey, one of us, right? We're talking about a flesh and blood human being in a world of reality, of time and space and issues of reality and time and space. A creature formed in the image of God. Okay? You with me? That's the first thing you notice. Secondly, you see his location. It's called Uz. As I pointed out last week in Lamentations, it speaks of Uz as a place of Edom, a location that represented, now get this, a place that represented for later Israel, for later biblical revelation, a nation who despised God's chosen people. Okay, I want you to think about that. Now, at the time of Job himself, that wouldn't have been an issue. Well, it might have been, but it will become prominent much later as you go through the Old Testament. You remember that Edom is actually another name for Esau, who was the brother of Jacob, but also the elder brother of Jacob, who was the one born first, but passed over by God for his mercies upon Jacob. Jacob was the one chosen to be the father of the nation of Israel, not Edom, not Esau. God passed over him. In fact, in Romans chapter 9, verse 13, Paul even goes farther and talks about Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. Okay? So it's a people representing resistance against the elect of God. Numbers chapter 20, that comes out very prominently as the people of Israel try to come through that territory, and the Edomites say, you're not passing through here. And God condemns them for that reality. Now that's going way back in time, all the way back to the days of Esau. So what you have here, in other words, is symbolically a man who preceded a nation that would resist the people of Abraham. He's living in a place that eventually would grow up a people who would resist the people of Israel, the people of Abraham. So he's living in the days of Abraham, but he is a contemporary of Abraham in the sense that he's almost symbolically looking like a foil against Abraham himself, if you think about it for a second. He's a man who is from an area who would be representative of a different and distinct line away from Abraham. Abraham over here in Canaan and his descendants, and Esau over here and his descendants. And so in some sense you have this picture that way. I don't know if that was intentional, but everything God does is intentional, right? So, So we learn his state, we learn his location, but we also learn his name. His name is Job. The word, interestingly enough, is etymologically related to the Hebrew word for enemy. It has a similar etymology as the word enemy. Now that's strange, isn't it? Why would Job be an enemy? Well, who would Job be an enemy of, right? Well, it's unlikely that he's an enemy of God, because as we'll discover through the rest of this sermon, he actually was favored by God. So that's unlikely to be an enemy of God. Possibly he's an enemy of Satan just by virtue of the fact that he becomes the direct attack of Satan. He becomes the target of Satan's attack. So his name could etymologically be referring to the fact that he's an enemy of Satan by virtue of the attacks. But there's a much more likely reason why this name may be similar. And this is just my opinion, but I think it's the case. Job represents what it means to be the general enemy of the forces of evil that stand against the good plans of God. He's a general representation, if you will, of the forces of evil that stand against the good plans of God. In other words, Job is an image to Satan of God's intentions. Job is an image of God's intentions. He embodies the reality of being loved by God, and particularly loved by God above Satan. Causing the devil to hate man because he hates God. Why does Satan come into the garden? Why does he slither in the form of a serpent into the garden to tempt the first humans? Why? Is it simply because he has nefarious ideas? Or is it because he truly hates God and attempts to destroy that which looks like God? He kills the messenger. He attempts to kill the messenger of God. He knows he can't take out God himself, right? But he can take out the creature made in the image of God. Job, then, this word enemy could very well imply that Job is the enemy, quote unquote, to Satan, who hates God and therefore desires to take out his hate upon the creature made in the image of God. He takes it out on us as those who represent God himself by virtue of the image of God in us. Just think about it like this. Why do the reprobate take out their ire and their hate against the people of God? Why do they do that? Doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? Doesn't make much sense for them to hate Christians. Why would they hate Christians? Why would they desire to cast away all remnants of Christianity? And the answer is because they know that we represent that which they are rebelling against. The church is the picture of what God's law commands over them. And so they must sweep it away. They must get rid of it. They must get rid of anything that reminds them of the fact that there is a God who has commanded them to be holy, has commanded them to be upright according to His law, God's law. And they know this. And so what they must do is they must destroy every vestige of that in the world, and that is us. Just as the world hates the church, so Satan hates humanity, because we represent God. Or let's talk about it in more childish terms. Satan hates us because we have the love of God over us that he didn't get. He wanted the place of prominence. He wanted to be the one that God would lavish his love upon. He wanted to be the one who would be given the gifts of God, and God chose to create a man instead, a little lower than the angels, right? And lavish his love upon him. The Son of God coming down to the earth, taking dust from the ground, forming it into the image of a man like himself, breathing life into that creature, putting his own nature into the creature, something that Satan himself had never had. And in his rebellion against God, he turns his wrath upon the creature to destroy the creature. So maybe the word Job here, as etymologically similar to the word enemy, is making that case. But the fourth thing we learn is the character of Job. And this is the most important part for us to consider this morning. We come today to something called a chiasm. C-H-I-A-S-M, a chiasm. Now, I'm sitting in my office during the course of this week, and this word chiasm pops into my mind. And I don't remember exactly when I learned this term, somewhere like 2004, when I was at Bethel studying this stuff. And that word pops back into my head. I'm thinking, now wait a minute, this is a chiasm, isn't it? And I had to Google the definition of chiasm to make sure I got it right. But I did. I'm thinking, I can't remember where I left my keys this morning, but I can remember the word chiasm. Now, what is a chiasm? Okay, a chiasm is a rhetorical device, in other words, a form of language, in which a sequence of ideas is presented and then repeated in reverse order. Okay, so what we call a mirror effect. The idea is being repeated and reflected back for two purposes. One, to define them, or to strengthen them. Okay, what we call the ABBA effect. No, not some 1970s Swedish rock band. The ABBA effect, A-B-B-A. So it's A as an idea, and B as an idea, and then repeats B with a different phraseology, and then repeats A. And that's what you see here in this verse, the second half of this verse. Now, this is very common in Hebrew poetry. You see it a great deal in the Psalms. Now, chiasms can be much bigger than that. Sometimes it could be A, B, C, D, X, D, C, B, A, for example. And so sometimes they're big ones, but they're very common in Hebrew poetry. You see them a great deal in the Psalms, and I think there are even some examples here in the book of Job. Here what we have is a simple chiasm, a very simple chiasm that defines and strengthens two terms. The first one is blameless, and the second one is upright. Okay, so blameless and upright are the two ideas being presented. A is the outer one, blameless, and B is the inner one, upright. And then their mirrors on the other side are turned away from evil, which is the mirror of blameless, and then upright and feared God. Feared God is the second one, the outer one, A. So A, the outer one, is blameless and turned from evil. I didn't say that right, so let me say that again. A is the outer one, blameless and turned away from evil on the outside. And then B is the inner one, upright and feared God. Okay? So they're explaining outward and inward in that fashion. It's similar to what is said in Genesis 6:9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah, in his generation, righteous, blameless on the inside. It's a similar idea. Notice the same words even being used, or similar words, to what we see here. So let's start with the inner. Okay, let's start with the inner. Upright and feared God. Okay, upright and feared God. He was upright, one who feared God. It is what characterizes Job inwardly. Okay? Inwardly. What characterizes Job inwardly. This word upright is the Hebrew word yasar, which means straight, level, right, or literally something standing upright versus that which has fallen over. Okay, so literally, it's something standing upright rather than something that's fallen over. So when you see a pillar standing upright, that is kind of the idea. It's literally standing upright. If you see the pillar fallen over, it's the opposite of that. Okay, so it's a fairly simple word to understand. It is the state of Job at his core. He feared God. He is upright, which means he fears God. That's the picture. So uprightness from a biblical perspective is the idea of fearing God. So Job is a man who is upright. He fears God. At his core, he fears God. Now, what does this mean to fear God? What does it mean to fear God? It's not language we use very much anymore, right? Evangelical circles, we don't talk about fearing God. What do we talk about? Loving God, or God loves us, right? That's the whole message of evangelicalism. So this idea of fearing God, like, get rid of that, but that's right here front and center. To be upright, this author writes, is to fear God. So I would suggest that there are three aspects to this idea of fearing God. First, to fear God is to recognize the immense gulf between the nature of God as God and yourself. To understand the immense gulf between the nature of God as God and oneself. We were talking a bit about this on Wednesday night in our discussion of chapter 7 of the 1689 Confession. The fact of the matter is, God ain't you and you ain't God. There is an immense gulf between the nature of God and us. It is so immense we might define it as infinite. Because we are creatures, we have limited time and space and knowledge and abilities. God is all the opposite of all of that. He is infinite, He is all-knowing, He is all-powerful. That gulf is so great that our minds simply cannot comprehend it. We really can't. We can try, but we can't, because everything as creatures that we see is within the realm of the finite. Everything we see is in the realm of the limited. Everything in this world is limited. Everything in this world is finite. Everything in this world is power, but only up to a certain point, usually just powerless, per se. Everything. And so we have a tendency to look through that lens, even at God. And so what do? Well, we anthropomorphize Him. We bring Him down to our level. We bring Him down to us. We say, well, God is my friend, my pal, my buddy. He loves me and I love Him, and, we have a great friendship. If I need Him, He's always there. Although most of the time I really don't. That's our anthropomorphizing of God. But to get our minds around the immensity of God is extraordinarily difficult for us to do. But that is what it means to fear God. To fear God is to recognize the unfathomable gulf between who He is and who you are. Or at least to try. I mean, we spin telescopes up into space to help us to look at the immensity of this universe that we're at. And yet at the same time, the men who put those up and look through the peepholes don't see the immensity of it. And thus they don't see the immensity of God. To fear God is to understand that He ain't us and we ain't Him. He is God. And we are but a speck of floating dust in an infinite universe that he happens to love. But nonetheless, to fear God is to recognize that. And I think that's one of the things we really need to teach our children in this generation, because it has been lost so badly in evangelical circles. We need to teach our kids about the grandness of God, the greatness of God, the immensity of God. He's beyond our comprehension. And the only reason we can have any knowledge of him at all is because he condescends to speak to us. And I take that word from the confession. In other words, to know that God is God, and that we are but puny, insignificant creatures whose very existence is entirely predicated on the mercy of God over us. We only exist because God remembers to give us breath each moment. And if he stops thinking of us, we vanish. To fear God is to recognize that immensity, to recognize that gulf. But secondly, it's also to understand the immense moral gulf between our sinfulness and God's holiness. Again, another message lost in obscurity in modern evangelicalism. Our God is a holy God. Thrice holy, as the angels say. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts, right? He's not just once holy or twice holy. He is holy, holy, holy. He is perfectly pure, blameless, and upright. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, impure in God. We are nothing but a bag of sin. Sinfulness permeates every aspect of ourselves. Our brains don't work without sin. Our hearts don't work without sin. Our language comes out full of sin, and so on. We are sinners through and through, and he is holy through and through. To fear God is to recognize that difference. Again, as so many do, well, Jesus loves me just the way that I am. Ha! No! That's preposterous on its face. A holy God is holy. He cannot love you the way that you are because you are sinful and hateful and rebellious against him as a human under the fall. We need to understand that gulf. We need to understand that gulf. We need to understand more specifically what the 1689 says in chapter 7, the sheer impossibility of solving our righteousness problem. The sheer impossibility of solving our righteousness problem, because we have a righteousness problem. We have a massive righteousness problem. We're born into this world guilty of Adam's sin. From the moment we take our first breath, we are guilty of what Adam did. And the pollution that Adam brought into this world, the corruption that exists, comes right into us from the moment of our conception. We are sinners through and through. And we cannot change that one bit. We can't make one step of righteousness towards God. Oh, I know we think we can. I know we've invented every imaginable form of religion on this planet for the last 10,000 years. We have tried everything imaginable under the sun to solve our righteousness issue. We haven't made one step towards it. I speculated about this on Wednesday night. Is it possible that the reason why we continue to seem to go backwards all the time is because we simply cannot make forward strides? Imagine what Eden would look like if man had not fallen into sin. How big would Eden be today? How much of this universe would be covered by Eden today if Adam had not sinned? Would we be exploring space at this point? Would we be out there actually on Mars instead of just sending little rovers there? Would we actually be there walking around, seeing what's going on? Would it? I wonder if science fiction isn't us from our souls wondering, why can't we seem to get there? And the answer is because we are so full of sin. We can't make forward steps. In the 1960s, we put a man on the moon. What have we done since? Nothing. We can't even get back to the moon. Why? We need to understand the immense moral gulf that exists. We understand who we really are in front of a God who is absolutely holy in every sense. To fear God is to recognize we have a righteousness problem. We have a real problem with standing before a holy God. To fear God is to go, you know what? I'm a sinner through and through, and what you really ought to do, if you were being fair, is destroy me. That's our problem. But to fear God is also, as a third aspect of this, is to honor God through self-sacrificial worship. Some in this world, God has given the ability, by His grace, to worship Him. Humanity left to itself would not worship God. Cain proves it in chapter 4 of Genesis. He proves it. Humans left to themselves would not worship God. But God has given to a people the ability to worship Him. And so for us who know Him, because He's revealed Himself to us, because He has come to us and spoken to us the gospel, and we have responded in faith, which He has given to us, we fear God by coming into His presence, falling down before Him, bowing our stiff necks before Him, and worshiping Him as the one true God. That is to fear God. To fear God is to recognize who He is. To fear God is to recognize who we are. But to fear God in the end is to honor God through self-sacrificial worship. We seek a healthy relationship with Him. To fear God is to present ourselves in utter obedience to God. What other choice do we have? If He is holy beyond our imaginations and we are sinful beyond our imaginations, what other choice do we have than to come before Him and throw ourselves before His mercy and to say to Him, you are God and I am unholy and unworthy. Have mercy on me, a sinner. That's a healthy fear of God. That's what worship is. Worship is coming before this God and recognizing who He is, and coming before this God and recognizing who we are. This is what it means to fear God. There is no gospel of Jesus without an absolute commitment to obedience and worship. There is no gospel except to a gospel of obedience and worship of this God. We know who He is, we know who we are, and we know what He commands. That's to fear God. This is who Job was. See it? This is who Job was. Not what he did, who he was. And what's the word I got to put in here? What his ontological state was. If my wife doesn't chisel that into my headstone, stone her, okay? Because that is the word. Look, if I don't get anything else across to you in this short little life I have left, let me get this across to you. Listen to me. It's not about what you do. It's who you are. Are you a child of the living God, or are you a reprobate? There's only two choices. You either are continuing in rebellion against God, shaking your fists against the heavens and hating Him, or you are one that He, by His grace, has turned to Him and made you a new creature. You're only one of two things. Job was upright. He feared God. He feared God by his nature. He was reckoned as righteous. Job considered by God to be morally upright in his state of being. Now, I'll hold that thought for a second. I'm going to call this Job's orthodoxy. Okay? Job's orthodoxy, all right? So if the inward part of the chiasm, the B, is upright and fears God, then the outer is blameless and turns away from evil. This would be what he does. Okay? This would be his practice. This would be what characterized Job outwardly. Now, this word blameless is a word used a lot in the Old Testament, the word tam, T-A-M. It means flawless and peaceful and strong and complete. Literally, the word means something to the effect of innocent or guiltless. All right? So this is the practices of Job. So he is blameless in the sense that he turns away from evil. You see it? He is blameless in that he turns away from evil. We could say it like this. He practiced outwardly what he was inwardly. Okay? Now I want you to notice that in the chiasm. What's on the inside of the chiasm? What's on the inward side? He fears God. He is upright. His nature is such that he's upright and fears God. The outward elements then are what flow from them. So the A comes out of the B in this instance. I'd be probably better off to put this chiasm as B-A-A-B, right? Because the B on the outside, the A in the original, on the outside is what flows out of what's on the inside. You see, the goal of sanctification, the goal of the work of the Spirit in your life and mine is to transform us outwardly to what we are on the inside. Now, that doesn't have to happen for the reprobate because the reprobate are already acting on the outside like they are on the inside. Because we come out of the womb doing that. Okay? We come into this world living outwardly like we are on the inside. We live out what we are. Jesus himself said, it is out of the heart that the mouth speaks. So what comes out of our heart is, what comes out of our mouth is what's already in our heart. Right? I'll put it like this. You learn a great deal about a man by the way that he prays. You'll learn a great deal about a man by the way that he prays. What's important to him? You'll hear it in his prayers. What we are at the core of us is what comes out in our life. That's the goal of sanctification. The goal of the Spirit of God is to transform us into what we are internally. If the Spirit of God has come and made us into the image of Christ internally, if he has justified us, if he's declared us righteous, because we have trusted in the promises of God, a work of the Spirit that has transformed us internally to trust in God, we should then be slowly becoming outwardly what we are inwardly. In other words, there should be more holiness coming out of our lives. Because if there's holiness in us, it should be coming out of us. The goal of the Christian church is not to just beat you with morality. The goal of the church is to help you to see who Christ is as he has transformed you into his image, and now go and live in that way. So this is the practical nature of Job. This is the outward nature of Job. The actions of the man, out of his inward nature, living as righteous before God, being morally upright in his living choices. So I will call this his orthopraxy. Some of you may not be familiar with that term. Orthodoxy is right beliefs. Orthopraxy is right practices. And you must have both. You must have orthodoxy. You must have right beliefs. You must have an internal nature that believes the things that God has revealed. That's orthodoxy. But you also must have orthopraxy to go with it. You must have right practices that flow out of that. Both of those are what the Spirit of God is attempting to accomplish in us. So see it? The outer part of the chiasm points back into the inner part of the chiasm. The man who is blameless and turns away from evil only does so because he is upright and fears God. And this is the character of Job. Now, I'm going to put before you a contention. I believe this is what Calvin was trying to get at. These realities about Job are not seriously questioned in the remainder of the book. Okay? Now, you may think so. Okay, you may think so. You may say, well, what about those speeches of Job's supposed friends? And the answer I would give to that, the answer that Calvin gave to that is, those guys were wrong. Now, they made an excellent argument about what they believed. Yes, they did an excellent job of attempting to prove their case, but they were proving that which was wrong. And you remember that God actually condemns them. We'll come back to that. Job's friends will question his righteousness and even blame his suffering on his unrighteousness, but their argument is wrong. Dare I say, sinful. Their observations are not just wrong, they're sinful, and God condemns them for it. You go to the end of the book. In Job chapter 42, in verses 7 to 9. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. Go get forgiveness. And my servant Job shall pray for you, and I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. Did he accept their sacrifice? No, he accepted Job's prayer. Job will attempt to argue for his own righteousness in this book a number of times, as I pointed out last week. But ironically, he does it rather poorly, which is the strange irony of this book. The 3 friends of Job attempt to prove that Job is unrighteous and therefore deserves to suffer. They make a wrong argument rather well. Job comes along to attempt to defend his own righteousness and does it in a faceplant sort of way a number of times in this book. Or as the author that I mentioned earlier said, Job doth protesteth too much at times and slips even into self-righteousness. In chapter 31, for example, I'll just give you one example. I opened right to it. He says, starting in verse 5, he says, if I have walked with falsehood, and my foot is hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. If my step is turned aside from the way, and my heart is gone after my eyes, and if any spot is stuck to my hands, then let me sow, and another eat, and let what grows from me be rooted out. In other words, if I've done all these evil things, then let somebody else come and take my place, and let me be blotted out. And God's going, oh, no, Job, don't go there. And God himself never questions the righteousness of Job, even as he promotes that righteousness before Satan. Slide your finger down to verse 8. Chapter 1, verse 8. And the Lord said to Satan, and Yahweh said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man? See that? Even God uses the same terms to describe the man as the author of the book does. Job's righteousness is never seriously questioned in this book, which means, as Calvin argues, the book assumes that Job was in fact a righteous man, and that it is this reality that becomes a pivotal point in understanding the book. This phrase, Job was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil, is the axle upon which the rest of the book turns. See it? Now, a couple of questions. Do these words imply that Job was perfect or sinless? No, not a chance. I already have demonstrated to you, have I not, that Job has a tendency to go into self-righteousness, so he proves his own sin in a few cases. I would have you to note that the term blameless is not the same as sinless, okay? The term blameless is not the same as sinless. Blameless has an inherent limitation embedded within itself. The term has an inherent limitation. To be blameless is simply to imply that an individual demonstrates over time a consistency of righteous behavior. I can't point to Job and say, well, look, see, over time he's wicked and unrighteous. There's no blame, quote unquote, that could be laid at the man. Even though he has sin in his life, in a general sense, he is without blame. He is blameless. So no blame can be held over him in that he demonstrates fidelity to God over the long term. It's the same idea that Paul uses when he writes about elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, when he says that an elder must be above reproach. Does that imply that Paul means that an elder appointed to the church must be without sin, sinless? Well, there's a couple guys in this room who are elders who are disqualified then. I'll let you figure out who they are. No, obviously, Paul doesn't believe that. Because if he did, he would be disqualified from his office as an apostle, which is a higher position than an elder. He would be disqualified because he happens to write Romans chapter 7, where he confesses the fact that he is sinful. No. The term above reproach, like the term blameless, is not about perfection. It doesn't apply that. It means a person who demonstrates over the long term that they are attempting to be consistent outwardly with what they are inwardly. And we see in them, at least over time, growth in that sense. So Job will demonstrate imperfections along the way. There's no doubt of that. But that does not change who he is before God. It does not change who he is before God. Yes, before men, he looks like a sinful man. What does he look like before God? What does the believer who's been justified by faith in Christ look like before men? Sinful, hypocritical, right? What does he look like before God? He looks holy. He looks like Christ. Because God sees him that way. So no, Job's not blameless and sinless, but he is blameless. He's seen by God as God sees him. Now, that leads to a second question. So, how could Job be considered upright and blameless after the fall? All right? Think about where we are here. We're 2,000 years before Christ. We're 600 years at least before the giving of the law at Sinai. We're living in the days when Abraham had no children even at all, when he and his wife were barren and Sarah had not yet conceived and bore a son. How could this man possibly be upright and righteous all the way back then? That doesn't make it. I mean, how? And the answer to that, of course, is through the same work that raises dead men to life now. The same work of God to raise men by the same gifts of grace bestowed upon elect men who lived 2,000 years before Christ, even as those who live now. I have a block of material here that I'm going to drop from this sermon, but I'd encourage you, if you want to look at it, to do two things. Number one, get the copy of the outline and look at what I've written here, but also consider what we're talking about on Wednesday nights in regarding to the covenant of grace and how we as Baptists understand this reality. I'll put it like this from Hebrews 11. that great list of men and women of faith from the Old Testament, right? Here's what the writer says in the midst of that chapter. He says, these Old Testament saints died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Skipping down to verse 39. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. In other words, they looked forward to the coming of the Redeemer in anticipation of his coming, but never saw him in their lives. They died before he came. They died centuries, millennia before he came. But they trusted in the promise of God, and that was accomplished by a work of God in them in the same way that God works in our day, 2,000 years after Christ, to accomplish salvation. No man knows God and is blameless and righteous without the work of God, period. And so the work of God had come to Job and had made him into something else. He didn't know how the promises of God made to him would come about, and he didn't know how that would be fulfilled by the Redeemer, but he was able to say, I know that my Redeemer lives. I have no idea who he is. I have no idea how he's going to accomplish the work, but here's what I know. I know he lives because I've met him. His name is Yahweh. So that leads to my third question now as we consider this verse, verse 1. How does this verse set the tone for the understanding of the rest of the book? If I said that this is the axle, the linchpin around which the rest of this book turns, how is that possible? And I would say it like this. Job's character is the unassailable reality that sets our hermeneutic for this book. Our interpretation of this book, how we interpret what's taking place within it, must revolve around the unassailable reality that begins it. Job was blameless and upright. More specifically, or namely, that although Satan hates man for being the creature to receive the special love and attention of Yahweh, and throws his hatred at the man, which we're going to see, the nature of the man is predetermined by God and cannot be changed by Satan's actions. Nowhere in this book is Satan's work in the life of Job going to change Job into something else. The way this book flows out is simple. Job is given massive suffering, pain, and destruction in his life. And a bunch of people come to try to give him some comfort in the midst of all that. They speak to all these things. They blather on about what they believe is true and right. And then God steps in and he speaks about his own nature. And then the book closes with him getting everything back. And at the end, here's what happens. Nothing. Nothing changes. Nothing changes. The nature of Job at the beginning, including all that he has, is identical to who he is and all that he has at the end. God throws in a little extra at the end for what he went through, but in reality, in the end, you read through the whole book, you come away going, that was a waste of time. But that's the point. Don't you see it? That's the point. Satan hates the people of God. He hates those who have been formed in the image of God, and he particularly hates those who are blameless and upright because God has done something in them. He particularly hates that. And so he does his level best to try to ruin them, make them suffer. But he cannot change who they are. He cannot change their status before God. The decree of God is such that those who are elect are untouchable by Satan. All their external life can be changed. All their external life can be made miserable. But he cannot touch who they are. He cannot change their nature. He cannot make them one bit less loved by God. In essence, this book can be summarized like this. Romans chapter 8. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Jesus Christ is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who's at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we're being killed all the day long. We're regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No! In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor whether things present or things to come, nor powers, nor height or depth, or anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. That's Job's prayer. That's Job's reality. Go ahead, Satan, take your best shot. You cannot take me away from Christ. You see it? That's a whole different way of looking at suffering, isn't it? I don't need to ask, why am I suffering? I don't need to ask, will God take it away? All I need to know is that no matter how it turns out, I belong to him. That's why Job 1:1 is there. Job is an upright, blameless man who fears God and turns from evil. That is unassailable.